They called it a toy. A box on wheels, they said. A farm cart dressed for war. When the first Willys rolled off the docks into the cold European wind, even the British officers raised eyebrows. It was small, absurdly small, beside the roaring monsters of the front. Tanks wore armor like kingdoms. Trucks carried entire kitchens. But this little four-wheeled thing looked like it belonged to a child with imagination and too much rope. And yet, in the mud and the smoke, the little machine had something none of the others did, a kind of stubborn energy, like a fox that refuses to die. The Americans arrived with them, the jeeps rattling in lines, each one coughing diesel breath into the morning air. To the Germans watching from their bunkers, they were an afterthought, an annoyance. A toy car, one officer sneered through his binoculars. Good for parades, maybe. The German war machine was built on spectacle. Tanks that groaned like thunder, armored half-tracks that tore through stone roads, engineering so precise it bordered on arrogance. Against that, the Jeep looked laughable. Its frame was thin. Its engine sang a high, defiant tune instead of a growl. But the soldiers who drove them, they saw something else. The Jeep could go where orders could not. It crossed ditches, streams, ruins. It carried a wounded man faster than a stretcher, a message quicker than a radio delay. When mud swallowed trucks whole, the Jeep danced over it, light-footed and confident. It did not boast. It simply went. In the early days, they were everywhere and nowhere. A shadow in the dust of retreat, a spark in the blur of pursuit. I remember the way they looked at sunrise. Silhouettes bouncing across fields of frost, headlights dimmed, engines whispering. The kind of sight that made a man believe motion itself might win the war. To the Germans, it was a curiosity, something to underestimate. Reports of light reconnaissance vehicles arrived in command posts and were filed away beneath thicker folders. Panzer divisions, aerial sorties, artillery range maps. No one filed a report about how many lives those small cars saved. The war, after all, has little patience for humility. One night near Caen, I saw 3 jeeps pull up beside a burnt-out tank. Their drivers climbed out, muddy, exhausted, laughing. They loaded stretchers, field radios, crates of rations. The engines sputtered, coughed, then steadied, as if waking from a short nap. One of them, a mechanic named Harris, patted the hood and muttered, "You're all heart, you stubborn thing." By dawn, the jeeps were gone again, leaving only tire tracks curling like signatures across the frost. The tank, massive, majestic, useless, still lay there, its strength turned to silence. That morning I understood something. The war was not only fought by giants. Sometimes it was carried on the backs of creatures small enough to be ignored. Across the lines, German strategists debated supply routes, artillery positioning, fuel scarcity. They studied maps, never noticing how often those small American vehicles appeared on their captured aerial photographs. Dots in impossible terrain, connecting scattered camps, darting through mud like fish through dark water. "Too light to matter," one colonel wrote in his margin. "Unsuitable for long operations." And yet, those dots kept moving. They carried generals through shellfire, priests through ruins, letters through nightmares. They were ambulances, taxis, mules, and thrones. Soldiers married inside them, died beside them, fell asleep on their hoods. The Germans had underestimated not a weapon, but an idea, that victory could ride on simplicity. In the language of war, prestige is often measured in tons of steel, in muzzle velocity, in the size of shadow a vehicle casts across the battlefield. The Jeep cast a small shadow, and yet it stretched far. Every campaign left stories of it. A Jeep pulling 5 men out of a ditch in Italy. A Jeep loaded with flowers rolling through Paris on Liberation Day. A Jeep crossing the Rhine on a pontoon bridge, its driver grinning like a boy who had just learned how far faith could travel on 4 tires. And somewhere, in a gray German office filled with the smell of stale tobacco, a general watched a reel of captured Allied footage. He leaned forward as the film clicked and stuttered. On screen, dozens of jeeps crossed a field, their drivers waving. The general frowned, not because he was impressed, but because he realized something too late. These were not toys, they were teeth, small, sharp, and everywhere. He turned to his aide and muttered, half to himself, "Maybe we should have paid attention." That was the moment, perhaps, when history shifted. Not because of firepower, but because of what a simple, tireless idea can do when the proud refuse to see it coming. When the war began to turn, when the tide that once belonged to iron and arrogance started to slide toward grit and endurance, the Jeep was already there, waiting. It did not demand medals. It simply kept moving. I remember standing on the edge of a French meadow, the air still thick with the sour smell of spent shells. Across that meadow they came in lines, hundreds of them, little green shapes against the gray morning. They moved like ants, unbothered by the uneven earth. Soldiers waved from the back seats, dust rising behind them like banners. Children ran to meet them. They had seen tanks before, those roaring beasts that shattered streets. But the Jeep was different. It smiled. It invited. Everywhere it went, the same thing happened. People leaned closer. Maybe because it looked so human, compact, unassuming, without armor or pretension. It was not a threat, it was a companion. In liberated towns, soldiers parked them beside fountains, loading them with loaves of bread and laughter. Some were painted with names: Daisy, Lucky, Red Fox. One had "To Hell and Back" scrawled across its hood in white chalk. Another carried a small French flag tied to its antenna, fluttering like a heartbeat. The Germans, who had once laughed, now saw them darting through the ruins, carrying prisoners, medics, engineers, chaplains. The once invisible became inevitable. They were everywhere at once, and the war began to feel smaller, more manageable, as if the roads themselves were being reclaimed. Historians later called it mobility, that dry, clinical word. But for the soldiers, it was something more spiritual. The Jeep gave them freedom, the kind that no map could measure. It could turn anywhere, cross anything, sleep under anyone's hand. In the midst of destruction, it offered the sensation of control, of being able to go. And to go is sometimes all a man needs to keep from breaking. I watched one cross a river that had swallowed bridges. The driver wrapped a rope around the steering column, set the engine in low gear, and guided it through the current. The machine shuddered, water up to its hood, and then, somehow, it climbed the opposite bank, coughing and steaming like a living thing that refused to die. The men on the shore cheered. Someone saluted. The Jeep answered with a sputter and a cough, its own kind of salute. In contrast, the German war machine, elegant, armored, precise, began to crack under its own weight. Their tanks required roads, their convoys required fuel, their machinery needed perfection. The Jeep needed none of those things. It thrived on imperfection. It loved bad roads, muddy fields, broken bridges. If the world was ending, the Jeep would find a way through the rubble. Perhaps that was its greatest secret. It understood the chaos better than its creators did. By the time the Allies crossed into Germany, the Jeep was no longer just a vehicle. It was a companion. Soldiers slept leaning against its wheels, wrote letters on its hood, cooked rations on its fenders. Some said you could tell how long a man had been at the front. A Jeep or my Jeep. There was even one story, half true perhaps, of a chaplain who baptized a Jeep after it carried an entire wounded unit out of a collapsing farmhouse. He poured water over the hood, whispered a prayer, and said, "If grace has an engine, it sounds like this." When victory finally came, when flags rose again and music returned to city squares, the Jeep rolled beside the tanks and trucks in the victory parades. But the crowds did not cheer for the tanks. They cheered for the little open car, the one that looked as if it had come straight from a farm. Children climbed onto its sides. Women threw flowers into its seats. Soldiers waved from them with faces cracked by smiles and sunburn. The Jeep had become something it never meant to be, a symbol of liberation. Not because it conquered, but because it endured. Not because it was powerful, but because it refused to stop. Somewhere, a German engineer in a gray suit watched the newsreel in silence. He had once laughed at that squat little frame, that exposed engine. He had once said, "No army could rely on such a thing." Now he watched as it rolled past the Arc de Triomphe, covered in flowers, the crowd shouting its name as if it were a person. His lips pressed together, and for a brief second he smiled. Not bitterly, but with something like respect. After the war, the Jeep did not retire. It went home, but not to rest. Farmers used it to plow fields that had been battlefields. Doctors used it to reach mountain villages. Adventurers drove it across continents. It carried no rank, no uniform, only a memory. That even the smallest, simplest thing can change the course of history when it keeps moving forward. They say symbols are born in factories but crowned in stories. The Jeep's story was written in mud, in laughter, in the long hum of an engine that refused to quit. The Germans once saw it as a toy, something beneath their notice. But history is written not by what is largest, but by what lasts. And in every photograph, in every parade, in every dusty road of liberation, there it is again, the little machine, square and stubborn, carrying the weight of a world that finally learned to move again. When the guns went silent, the roads did not. The same paths that had carried troops and supplies now carried farmers, doctors, dreamers, all moving through a world trying to remember peace. And still, the little Jeep rolled on. It was strange watching something forged for war find a new kind of purpose. In the ruins of Europe, it looked both out of place and perfectly at home. A machine born for destruction now ferrying bread, tools, and newborns. Its engine, once the heartbeat of battle, became the sound of rebuilding. Everywhere it seemed to belong. In France, it pulled carts of stone to mend bombed bridges. In Italy, it climbed the hills where vineyards were coming back to life. In Germany, it hauled lumber for homes that would not fall again. The men who had once fought each other now leaned together under the same hood, tightening the same bolts, laughing at the same stubborn starter. In America, they came home too, thousands of them, shipped back on the same freighters that had carried them overseas. They rolled down gangways into sunlight and applause. War heroes with mud still on their tires. But the soldiers who had driven them could not forget what the Jeep had meant. They bought the surplus models, tuned them up, and drove them across open plains and forest trails. The war had taught them how far these machines could go, and peace gave them the chance to find out. The Jeep became something new, the first true companion of adventure. Where roads ended, it began. Magazines began printing photographs. Men and women smiling behind dusty goggles, their Jeeps perched on cliffs, splashing through rivers, parked beside campfires. The vehicle that won the war, the headline said, now wins the wilderness. But for those who remembered, it was more than a slogan. It was a bridge between two worlds, the dark one they'd survived and the bright one they were trying to build. It carried no fear now, only curiosity. It was freedom on four wheels, the sound of youth returning to an exhausted planet. In the years that followed, every nation that had once underestimated it tried to copy it. Germany, humbled, designed its own light utility vehicles. Britain built the Land Rover, a spiritual cousin with a stiff upper lip. France, Italy, Japan, all followed. But none could quite capture the same spirit. Because the Jeep had something the others didn't, a story. A legend that was written not in blueprints, but in sweat, laughter, and sacrifice. It wasn't just a vehicle that worked, it was a vehicle that mattered. I remember one morning, years after the war, on a quiet back road in Normandy. The air smelled of grass and wet earth. A man in his 60s was driving a faded green Jeep, its paint chipped, its hood dented in the exact shape of history. In the passenger seat sat his grandson, no more than 8 years old. "Grandpa," the boy asked, "is it true you fought in the war?" The man smiled, the kind of smile that carried both weight and peace. "Yes," he said, "and this old thing carried me home." The Jeep rattled over a puddle, splashing the morning light. It did not roar, it purred. And somehow, in that sound, there was everything: fear, hope, endurance, victory, memory. Decades later, when museums displayed tanks behind velvet ropes, the Jeep still roamed the world. In mountain villages, you could still find one parked beside a barn. In deserts, explorers still trusted them. In jungles, aid workers still loaded them with medicine. It never asked for ceremony. It simply remained useful. The quiet kind of immortality. Children would climb on them and pretend to drive, unaware that their laughter echoed across generations. Mechanics would restore them, hands black with oil but eyes shining with respect. And the veterans, the few who were left, would nod and say softly, "She never quit, that one." The Germans, for their part, learned their lesson well. Their engineers began to admire what they once dismissed: simplicity, adaptability, humility. A few even admitted, half in jest, half in truth, that the Allies' greatest weapon wasn't the bomber or the tank, but this small, stubborn machine that refused to obey the rules of scale. In the end, the Jeep had defeated not just an army but an idea, the belief that greatness must always look imposing. The roads of the modern world still carry echoes of it. Every SUV, every off-road vehicle, every trail machine traces its lineage back to that simple outline. Four wheels, open air, a promise of motion. And though the years have layered it with comfort and chrome, that first spirit, that battlefield stubbornness, still hums somewhere deep in its gears. When you turn the key and feel that vibration, you are touching history itself. A heartbeat that once pulsed through mud, snow, and victory parades. The war ended long ago, but the Jeep never did. It rolls still, across continents, across memory, across generations. It reminds us that sometimes the most powerful things are not the biggest nor the loudest, but the ones that simply refuse to stop moving forward. The Germans laughed once. Now the world remembers. And every time a Jeep engine turns over, somewhere, softly, history answers back. History, I've learned, never ends where you think it will. When the last parades faded and the medals were hung in quiet rooms, the Jeep could have become a relic, a museum piece, a story told in past tense. But it refused to grow old. Some machines are born for a moment. Others are born for movement. The Jeep was both. In the years that followed the war, the world changed faster than anyone could have imagined. Highways appeared where battlefields once stretched. Cities rose from rubble, their lights brighter than the bombs that had once fallen on them. Airplanes shrank the globe. The future arrived with chrome and concrete. And yet, amid all that modern noise, the Jeep remained humble. Still boxy, still simple, still unmistakable. It belonged to everyone. Farmers drove it to markets. Photographers took it into deserts. Young couples drove it up mountain trails with the wind tearing through their hair. It had traded its military paint for civilian colors, but the soul underneath was the same. That was the quiet miracle of it. The transformation from instrument of war to symbol of freedom. By the 1950s, magazines began calling it the car that can go anywhere. They meant it as advertising, but to those who had lived its story, the phrase was almost sacred. Anywhere was not just geography. It was a promise. It meant beyond fear, beyond the trenches, beyond the ruins, beyond the grief that had once filled the roads. To drive a Jeep was to tell the world that you still believed in motion, in forward no matter what. I remember one photograph, a man in a checkered shirt standing beside his Jeep at the edge of the Grand Canyon. The caption read, "From Normandy to Arizona, same wheels, same heart." It was more than a boast, it was a revelation. A machine that had once pulled bodies from craters was now carrying souls toward horizons. And across the ocean in Germany, the country that had once dismissed it, a new generation looked at that photograph and saw something else. Possibility. Young engineers studied its blueprints, admiring the way simplicity could achieve what complexity never could. Old soldiers, those who had once fought against it, saw the photographs and shook their heads, half smiling, half remembering. Perhaps one was quoted as saying, "We underestimated not the machine, but the people who believed in it." As the decades rolled on, the Jeep became more than a vehicle. It became a kind of language. It spoke of independence, of dusty roads, of laughter echoing through canyons. In movies, heroes drove it. In postcards, it became shorthand for adventure. Children drew it in notebooks. Square, cheerful, ready. Writers compared it to loyalty, to courage, to stubborn hope. And for veterans, it remained a friend, as familiar as a heartbeat. When they gathered at reunions, someone would always bring one. They'd stand around it like men at a campfire, hands on the hood, telling stories of mud and miracles. Somewhere in every tale, there was a moment when the Jeep had done something impossible. Climbed a hill, crossed a river, carried a man home. No one questioned it. By then, everyone knew. In the 1970s and 80s, new generations discovered it again. The students, the travelers, the restless. They didn't know the war. They didn't need to. They saw in the Jeep a reflection of something timeless. The hunger to keep moving, to find new places, to see what waited beyond the next bend in the road. It had become a paradox. A machine of war reborn as an emblem of peace. Its open body no longer needed armor. Its freedom was its protection. When the world grew crowded and complicated, the Jeep remained refreshingly honest. No chrome, no excess, just motion. Four wheels and faith. Decades later, museums began displaying them beside tanks and aircraft. But somehow the Jeep never seemed trapped behind glass. Even standing still, it looked as though it might roll away at any moment. Through the door, down the street, toward the horizon, Curators would polish it, photographers would pose beside it, but the veterans who visited the exhibit often ignored the plaques. They would rest their hands on the hood, close their eyes, and listen. If you were quiet enough, you could hear it too. The faint ghost of an engine, the hum of determination. It's easy to forget how close the world once came to losing itself, but every time I see that simple grille, 7 slats, proud and plain, I remember. Not just the battles, but the rebuilding. Not just the destruction, but the drive to move beyond it. The Jeep is no longer a soldier. It doesn't need to be. Its weapon now is memory. And in that memory lies a lesson that no general ever wrote down. That greatness isn't always loud, and victory isn't always about power. Sometimes it's about persistence, the quiet courage to keep going when no one believes you can. Today, the name has changed, the models are sleeker, the roads smoother. But somewhere, in a barn or a museum or a forgotten shed, an old Willys Jeep still waits. A turn of the key, a cough of the engine, and the past stirs again. Its story belongs to all of us now. The farmers, the dreamers, the survivors. It is not just a machine that won a war, but one that refused to stop teaching us how to move forward. And as long as wheels turn and engines hum, that lesson endures. The Germans once saw a toy. The world found a symbol. A square little vehicle built for utility, reborn as an idea. Proof that the simplest designs, like the simplest truths, are the ones that outlast empires. They say time erases all things, that engines rust, paint fades, and legends dissolve into nostalgia. But some stories refuse to die. They live not in museums or photographs, but in the way people move, the way they dream of the road ahead. The Jeep became such a story. It began as a machine, became a symbol, and finally turned into something larger, an idea. An idea that movement itself is a form of faith. In every era since the war, it has found new roads. When explorers crossed the dunes of the Sahara, they trusted the same four wheels that once climbed the hills of Normandy. When aid workers delivered food to villages unreachable by trucks, it was often a Jeep that carried them through flood and mud. And when filmmakers searched for metaphors of freedom, they reached instinctively for its silhouette. The open cabin, the simple shape, the unpretentious strength. It is strange how a thing so small could become so immense. Not in size, but in meaning. I have seen it in places far removed from the roar of Europe. In Nepal, painted with flowers, carrying monks up a winding path. In Africa, its tires red with clay, filled with laughter and song. In South America, parked beside a cafe, its hood doubling as a table for morning coffee. It carries the same defiant rhythm wherever it goes, that soft, uneven hum of endurance. Even when the logos changed, when new models came wrapped in comfort and chrome, that rhythm remained underneath. You could still feel it in the way the steering wheel trembled, the way it leapt at every bump, eager as a dog smelling the horizon. It never became polite, it stayed honest. Maybe that's why people love it, because it reminds them of what it means to keep going. In a world built on convenience, the Jeep asks something of you. To pay attention, to grip the wheel, to lean forward when the hill gets steep. It doesn't carry you effortlessly, it invites you to join the effort. And effort, the humankind, is what freedom is made of. The Germans once built machines that sought perfection. The Jeep was never perfect. It was flawed, noisy, temperamental, sometimes leaky, and utterly alive. That imperfection was its humanity. I think often about how legends evolve. First they belong to history, then to memory, and finally to myth. The Jeep has reached that third form, not because of how it was built, but because of what it represents: persistence without pride. It is the myth of motion, that simple act of pressing forward when all logic says stop. It reminds us that power isn't only in speed or armor, but in endurance, in faith, in movement itself. There's a story I love, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps true. A Jeep was found decades later, deep in a jungle clearing in Burma. Vines had wrapped around its frame, leaves filling its seat. Local villagers said it had appeared long ago, driven by soldiers who never returned. Yet somehow, when a mechanic arrived and turned the crank, the engine sputtered, then caught. After years of silence, it roared to life again, startling birds into the air. I imagine the sound echoing through the trees, the ghost of history shaking off the dust, reminding the world that motion never truly ends. And so it endures in stories and in steel. Every Jeep that rolls off a line today, sleek and modern, carries within it the same stubborn heart that once beat across the battlefields. Every driver who feels that first bump on a dirt road, every hand that steadies the wheel as the tires slip and catch, is part of that lineage. They may not know it, but they are reenacting something sacred, the ancient human act of refusing to stop. In the quiet of evening, sometimes I pass one on a back road, an old Willys still running, its paint dulled to the color of memory. The driver waves, and I nod back, though we do not know each other. We share something older than introductions, an understanding. That life, like war, like travel, like time itself, is just a long road of obstacles. And that victory, real victory, is not in how fast you reach the end, but that you keep moving, no matter how rough the ground becomes. The Jeep taught that lesson better than any general or philosopher ever could. It carried the wounded, the hopeful, the lost, and somehow it carried the future too. A future that laughs at arrogance, a future that rewards resilience, a future that knows even the smallest thing can carry the weight of the world if it refuses to stop. They laughed once, those officers behind their binoculars, watching a small boxy machine rattle across the mud. They saw weakness where there was will. They saw simplicity where there was genius. History, as always, had the last word, and it spoke softly in the hum of an engine that still refuses to die. Some machines break, some survive. A rare few become eternal. The Jeep, that stubborn little miracle of motion, but belongs to the last kind. It keeps moving even now, through dust, through memory, through time itself. A reminder that freedom, in the end, is nothing more than the courage to go forward.